Okay, vegans, you say that a vegan diet isn't expensive. So explain this. When I go food shopping, I can get a kilogram packet of supermarket own brand chicken breasts for £6. Now that's going to last me at least a week's worth of meals. Or I could swap it for the supermarket own brand vegan chicken breasts, and that will cost me £9.73 for the same amount, which is over 60% more. So a vegan diet is just simply more expensive, and that's just the way that it is. Or is it? The truth is that plant-based foods actually aren't more expensive. It's just that animal-based foods are cheaper than they should be when we're at the checkout. And the reason they're so cheap is because of a number of different reasons, including things like supermarket markups. But most importantly, the main reason that it's like this is because of agricultural subsidies.
Agricultural subsidies, put simply, is our money, taxpayers' money, being paid directly to farmers to produce food. On face value, it's quite a sensible idea, because if we have weather shocks or if there's fluctuations in trade prices, we want to protect the baseline of society, which is food. But it's fraught with environmental problems, and it's used to prop up the very, very worst kind of agriculture.
Agricultural subsidies artificially drive down the cost for the consumer by cutting the costs for producers via government intervention. But at the moment, they fund the production and consumption of meat, dairy, and animal feed far more than they do fruits and vegetables. Not only has our use of agricultural subsidies created a false economy around food, but it also helped drastically increase the number of animals we farm and the amount of land that we use for animal farming, which has led to extreme suffering, poor population health, and the degradation of the environment. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the history of agricultural subsidies in the UK, as well as why they've been an absolute disaster. But also importantly, I'm also going to discuss how agricultural subsidies can actually be used to create a fairer and more equitable food system for everyone. In the Agricultural Act of 1947, the British government announced a series of unprecedented agricultural subsidies aimed at stimulating production and making domestic agriculture more self-sufficient, as the war had revealed the vulnerability of a nation reliant on foreign imports for its food supply.
Pre-war, Great Britain imported 2/3 of the food it ate, but on that old system, the British could never have survived the war, so they cut down their food imports by half.
The subsidies were given to farmers producing meat, cow's milk, eggs, feed, grains, potatoes, and sugar beet. Animal farmers were by far the largest recipients, in part because rising household incomes, mass marketing campaigns, and new technology to improve shelf life increased demand for these products, and also in part because fruits and vegetable farmers were doing fine on their own. Moreover, animal products were erroneously believed to be a superior food source and were viewed as a symbol of power. In any case, the Act marked a historical increase in state involvement in the agricultural market, and without doubt was a leading contributor in the intensification of animal farming, as well as driving perception that animal products are cheap. Now here's where things get a little bit darker. The amount of taxpayers' money that farmers would receive was determined following a yearly review. Now these yearly reviews consisted of government ministers consulting not with the agricultural workers themselves, but with the head of the farmers' unions who represented the interests of larger industry. It was noted in a 1985 report on post-war agricultural policy that astonishingly, the farmers' unions were in a unique position among British industries because they had a statutory right to consultation over the prices that they would receive for their produce. Every year, the farmers' unions struck better deals and received more assurances, even to the point where subsidies couldn't be taken away from them. For example, for any product, the guaranteed price the government would give could be reduced by no more than 4% per year, and for animal products, the reduction was to be no more than 9% in any 3-year period. The wording of the policies was also adapted to be more sympathetic to farmers, changing the focus from minimum prices to things like remuneration and living standards. The farmers' unions even convinced the government to let them overproduce, stating that this overproduction could be used as food aid for developing nations, among other things. Of course, that's not what happened though. This overproduction of food led to what later became known as milk lakes and butter mountains. So in reality, these policies, which were championed by the agricultural industry itself, led to the largest animal farmers making more money, scaling up their farms even more, creating even more profit as a consequence, and obviously resulting in more animal suffering, more environmental degradation, and a decreasing in societal health. So how on earth did this absolutely absurd use of public money fly under the radar? Well, the only people outside of government at that time who would have been properly able to challenge these handouts were academics publishing reports and papers at universities. But it turns out that much of their research was receiving funding from the same government departments involved in the legislating of these subsidy policies. In other words, there was just a slight conflict of interest. The 1985 report concludes, this unique example of cooperation between agricultural interests over the development of agriculture and the fixing of prices arguably served to reduce criticism of the system. Everybody with the knowledge of the details was likely one way or another to be a part of the system. If the objective of post-war British farming policy was to make agriculture self-sufficient and sustainable, well, it achieved the complete opposite. But where it did succeed is in aligning public demand with the most damaging and unethical system of farming that there is. Fast forward to today, and well, not much has changed, except that more animals are now suffering, and the physical land, which has been depleted of most of its natural forests and shrublands, has increased to make way for more pasture for more farmed animals. For the last 50 years, the UK has been functioning under the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, or the CAP. The backbone of this is direct payments, where the government pays farmers per hectare of land that they own, regardless of what they do with it. This policy has encouraged land to be hoarded by a small number of increasingly rich and powerful people. Of the 59 billion euros given each year, over 47 billion, or 80% of them, are given to the largest 20% of farms. Research by Greenpeace suggests that 1 in 5 receiving EU farming subsidies is a millionaire or a billionaire. Every year, some of the largest recipients in the UK include Sandringham Farms, a predominantly meat-based business owned by, wait for it, the royal family, as well as Grosvenor Farms, a dairy owned by the Duke of Westminster, and Juddmonte Farms, a racehorse breeding enterprise owned by a Saudi prince. Aside from being owned by the very upper class of society, these places also have something else in common. They all farm animals.
Essentially, the system that we've ended up with right now is policymakers and bureaucrats throwing up their hands, looking at a complex system of trade and agriculture and environment, and going, it's too complicated, let's just pay per area of land, as that's the simplest baseline that we can do. And the reason that this is such a terrible use of money is that there's one kind of agriculture that uses more land than any other, and that's the most damaging kind of agriculture, and that's animal agriculture. Around
85% of the UK's agricultural land is used for grazing animals or growing their feed. So even though landowners can do pretty much anything they want with their land under the CAP, many choose to farm animals or produce animal feed, which coincidentally uses more land and therefore picks up more subsidies than crops intended for human consumption. But if the goal of the CAP is to improve food productivity whilst increasing food security, which is what they say, then why does it incentivize the form of farming which uses more land yet produces less food than any other? After all, globally speaking, animal farming uses 83% of agricultural land and provides only 18% of the calories that are consumed, which means that plants provide 82% of all the calories using only 17% of agricultural land. But then again, the CAP apparently is also meant to protect the environment, even though it gives millions of euros every single year to animal farmers, and the EU's own governing body has said that meat and livestock subsidies are environmentally harmful. Now, since Brexit, the UK has been working on implementing a new subsidy scheme called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS, which is supposed to reward farmers for making environmental improvements on their land. Now, at first glance, this would appear to be a step in the right direction, but on second glance, unfortunately, this is nothing more than greenwashing.
The Environmental Land Management Scheme has got some promising bits to it, but has it actually really got rid of the problem with the original one of paying people per hectare? Well, no, because most people, most farmers under this new scheme will continue to get their funding through one of the 3 streams of the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is called the Sustainable Farming Incentive. Now, to be specific about this, if you want to get your Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is a significantly smaller payment, but it's still a payment per hectare of land, so you still get more of it if you use more land, all you have to do at the lowest level is produce a soil management scheme. You don't have to implement it, you just have to do one. You just say, yeah, our plan is that we'll manage the soil in this way.
So why are people in power so reluctant to change and deliver what would be undeniably a more sustainable and ethical plant-based food system? Well, maybe it's because of the government's own ties to animal agribusiness. In fact, you don't have to look far at all to find current and former animal farmers in positions of political power. Take, for example, the UK government's Minister of State for Food, Mark Spencer, who is a former dairy farmer who campaigned against a bill to improve animal welfare and ban live exports, or the fact that the House of Lords has been historically compromised of large landowning aristocrats who have ventures in hunting, shooting, and of course, farming animals. Now, potentially unsurprisingly, it's a strikingly similar situation in the US, where Congress's agricultural committees are dominated by lawmakers from farming states and districts, or by lawmakers who have received funding and backing from the farming industry, or even farmers themselves. In fact, between 1995 and 2020, 33 members of Congress and their immediate families received nearly $16 million in federal farm subsidies. Moreover, the United States Department for Agriculture, or the USDA, which is the government department that sets out nutritional guidelines, also exists in part to promote the dairy industry, a collaboration which it openly acknowledges. So these are some of the reasons why we've ended up with a food system where an animal being bred into existence, fattened up on plants, and then ultimately killed for us can cost less than a punnet of blueberries or a few tins of beans. And unfortunately, although potentially predictably, it's because this current system favours the interests of a small minority of farmers, landowners, politicians, and business people. Even those farming animals which do not directly benefit from large subsidies, like pigs and chickens who don't graze on pasture, well, they pick up other subsidies from animal feed, which combined with tax relief and an intensive production system leads to incredibly low prices at the checkout. But what is so important to remember is that this is a system based on a false economy. Experts calculate that the current food system has between 40 and 94 billion pounds of hidden costs. The evidence is clear. If animal farming was forced to cover the costs of the health and environmental problems that it causes, well, even with the current level of subsidization, it simply wouldn't be financially viable. And of course, what of the other hidden cost? The victims of our food system. Sure, subsidies might mean that you can buy chicken flesh, lamb livers, or cow burgers for less than you could spend on a bag of toilet paper, but does this actually reflect the true value of a life? Is this really how cheap life has become to us? Animal suffering is now so widespread and extreme that it seems impossible to find a way out of the mess that we have created. But it really could be just as simple as directing our subsidies elsewhere. And finally, some good news. Subsidies don't have to be bad. They can be used to ensure that everyone has access to an abundance of healthy, affordable, and ethical food that is produced in an environmentally responsible manner. But in order to do this, we must urgently transition away from animal agriculture. Now, fortunately for us, scientists and academics have done the work exploring what different subsidy systems could actually look like. So let's take a look now at what agricultural reform could actually achieve. A paper published in Nature, one of the most rigorous and respected scientific journals in the world, analysed various options for reforming global agricultural subsidies and calculated the outcomes on health, climate, and the economy. They found that restructuring subsidies and redirecting them to plant-based foods with beneficial health and environmental characteristics, such as fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes, would lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and diet-related mortality. There would also be increased production and better calorie efficiency, meaning less nutrition wasted and recycled through animals. Plus, there would be a larger, healthier workforce and global increases in economic welfare of up to $5.5 billion, which could be invested in more helpful initiatives like rewilding and, of course, alternative proteins. Plus, as it stands now, research has shown that a whole foods plant-based diet can cut your food budget by as much as 1/3 when compared to an animal-based diet. Now just imagine how much more affordable we could make ethical, sustainable, healthy plant-based foods if we subsidized our agricultural system with that as the priority. Now, obviously, from a purely health perspective, plant-based whole foods are optimal, and we will have an abundance of those if they are subsidized. But what of people's appetite for meat, dairy, eggs, and even processed foods? It's hardly going to disappear overnight. Well, this is where alternative protein comes in. This encompasses any plant-based and food technology alternatives to animal protein, so things like soy and wheat protein, or indeed even cell-cultured meat. In 2018, the government commissioned an independent review of the British food system, which was published in 2 parts in 2020 and 2021 as the National Food Strategy. Along with urging the shift towards a plant-based food system, the report also highlighted the potential of investing in alternative proteins. The report said the UK should be positioning itself at the forefront of this new industry. We estimate that developing and manufacturing alternative proteins in the UK rather than importing them would create an estimated 10,000 new factory jobs and secure 6,500 jobs in farming. So far, the government has been slow to offer support and investment to companies developing novel proteins. We are in danger of missing a prime opportunity for green growth. One food technology mentioned in the report, which looks particularly promising, is precision fermentation. This is where yeast and bacteria are programmed in the same way as animal proteins, then brewed. It is essentially like making beer, but using protein and fat, and the end result is animal-free proteins and fats that are biologically identical to those which we currently get from animals. Now, this process is already used to produce 99% of the world's insulin supply and 80% of rennet, which is an enzyme used for producing cheese. So it's an already tried and tested technology. An environmental group called Replanet have produced a detailed report outlining how precision fermentation could be used to transform our food system. The Reboot Food Report, which was produced in collaboration with strategists, scientists, and politicians, calculated that if we scaled up precision fermentation, all of the world's protein could be grown on an area of land the size of London. They call for the phasing out of subsidies that are being given to animal agriculture, and for instead these subsidies to be given to different things, including, of course, plant-based food production, alternative food technology like precision fermentation, and the rewilding of land that would no longer be needed if we weren't farming animals on it. Now, of course, for some animal farmers, the concern will be that they will be out of a job. But of course, as we shift into a world that's looking to become more sustainable and more ethical, unsustainable and unethical systems of farming will be changed. And this isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. Whether or not we change how we produce food is not something that we actually have much of a say over. The question is, how soon do we act? And do we act responsibly to ensure that the reforms that take place are beneficial for animals, humans, and indeed farmers as well? That's exactly why the government needs to step up now to aid and help farmers as we transition out of animal farming and fishing and into a different system of farming and land management. And of course, these farmers could be supported as they transition into different forms of land management, like rewilding, like alternative forms of protein production, and of course like plant-based farming in general. The government could also fund retraining schemes as well as retirement packages for those who are looking to exit the industry, and on top of that the government can offer state buyouts for those who are looking to leave the industry or who want to start a different business or a different career. So whatever the option may be, we can change how we produce food and ensure that those who currently make money from farming animals can receive money to support themselves and their families elsewhere. It's just importantly and essentially, we must change how we produce food in order to make it more sustainable, better for us, and of course, better for the animals as well.